You know that feeling. The one where everything looks fine, your job, your routine, the walls around you. And then, for no reason you can name, the floor tilts. Just slightly, just enough. You called that a bad day, a mood, a glitch. What if it wasn't? What if that tilt is the most honest thing you felt all week, because the ground you're standing on was never as solid as you needed it to be? Right now, in the empty space between your body and this screen, in the nothing you're breathing through, something is happening, something violent, something scientists spent a century trying not to believe. The vacuum of space is not empty. It never was. And once you understand what's actually there, you'll stop asking why your life feels unstable and start asking a more dangerous question. What if instability was never the problem? Let's start with the word vacuum. You picture nothing, a void, outer space, black and still, empty in the most complete sense of the word, the absence of anything at all. That picture is wrong, and it has been wrong for almost 100 years. What physicists call the quantum vacuum isn't a void, it's a field. A field of energy that never sits still, never goes quiet, never actually reaches zero. Not even in theory, not even in the coldest, darkest, most empty pocket of the universe you could find. Pairs of particles flicker into existence out of that field constantly, for fractions of a second so small you couldn't measure them with anything you own, and then they vanish again. Physicists call them virtual particles. Not because they're fake, because they're too brief to be pinned down as real in the way a chair or a hand is real, but their effects are real, measurable, provable. Here's where I need to be honest with you about something, because this is the part of the story where most people, including for a long time me, get quietly unsettled and don't say so out loud. I remember the first time I understood this, not read about it. Understood it, the way you understand something in your chest before your brain catches up. I was in my 20s, going through a period where nothing in my life would hold still. A job that dissolved, a relationship that kept almost ending, a sense of self that felt like it was being rewritten weekly. I wanted, more than almost anything, for something to just be solid, fixed, dependable. I remember reading for the first time that even empty space at the most nothing thing in the universe isn't actually still. It's seething. And instead of finding that terrifying, I found it strangely, almost embarrassingly comforting. Because if the universe itself doesn't get to have a still point, maybe I wasn't failing at something everyone else had figured out. Maybe nobody gets the still point. Maybe stillness was never the deal. That reframe is the whole reason this channel exists. But we're getting ahead of the story. Back to the vacuum. If it's not truly empty, then what is holding all that flickering energy in place? What law of physics allows something to come from nothing, even for an instant? The answer starts with a man named Werner Heisenberg, and a principle that would eventually crack open our entire idea of what nothing means. In 1927, Heisenberg proposed what's now called the uncertainty principle. In its simplest form, it says you cannot know both the exact position and the exact momentum of a particle at the same time. The more precisely you pin down one, the blurrier the other becomes. This wasn't a statement about our tools being bad. It wasn't, we don't have a good enough microscope yet. It was, and still is, a statement about the actual structure of reality. Uncertainty isn't a gap in our knowledge. It's built into the universe at the most fundamental level physics has ever reached. Now stretch that principle from position and momentum to energy and time, and something strange happens. The same uncertainty applies. You cannot know the exact energy of a system at an exact moment in time, which means, for impossibly short windows, energy can appear to fluctuate, can appear to borrow itself from nothing, as long as it pays the loan back before the universe notices. That's the mechanism behind virtual particles. Not magic, not mysticism, a direct, mathematically provable consequence of uncertainty being real. You, walking around feeling like a stable, singular, defined person, you are standing inside a universe that, at its most basic layer, cannot even commit to a fixed value for empty space. Not for one full second. I want to be precise about what this proves and what it doesn't. Heisenberg's principle proves that certainty about certain paired properties is fundamentally physically impossible. Not practically difficult, impossible. It does not prove that reality is random in some cosmic meaningless sense, and it does not prove, despite what 1,000 self-help books will tell you, that everything is energy in some vague, all-purpose way that lets you skip the hard parts of actually living. It proves something narrower, and honestly more unsettling, that the floor under all matter, all energy, all of it, is built out of fluctuation, not fixture. This explains the physics. It does not yet explain why, on some level under your ribs, that fact makes you uneasy. Why a universe that can't sit still might be telling you something about why you can't either. That's still ahead of us. In 1948, a Dutch physicist named Hendrik Casimir was working at Philips Research in the Netherlands, trying to solve a completely different, much more boring industrial problem, something to do with the stability of colloidal suspensions in paint. Not exactly the stuff of a physics thriller, but somewhere in that unglamorous research, he did the math on a question nobody had thought to ask seriously. If you take two uncharged metal plates and place them in a total vacuum with genuinely nothing between them and nothing acting on them, would they stay perfectly still? He predicted they would move toward each other, not because of gravity, not because of any charge, any magnet, any conventional force. He predicted that two plates, sitting in the most nothing environment physics could construct, would be pulled together by the vacuum itself, because the fluctuating field between them behaves differently than the field outside them, and that difference in pressure pushes the plates inward. For decades, this was just an equation. Elegant, disturbing, unconfirmed. Then in 1997, physicist Steven Lamoreaux built an experiment precise enough to actually measure it, and the plates moved. Almost exactly the amount Casimir's math had predicted 50 years earlier from a desk in a paint lab. You, born decades after Lamoreaux ran that experiment, are living in a universe that was already proven, measured, confirmed, replicated, to exert a physical, mechanical force out of what should have been absolutely nothing. Not a metaphor, a force. Newtons, something you could, in theory, feel on your skin if the plates were big enough and your hand small enough to fit between them. Say it with what that force is actually made of. It's not energy in some poetic sense. It's the accumulated pressure of trillions of virtual particles blinking in and out of existence, tugging matter around in a direction, in real time, everywhere, always, including in the space between your ribcage and this sentence right now. Here is what the Casimir effect proves precisely: that the quantum vacuum has measurable physical consequences, that empty space is not physically inert, and that fluctuation at the smallest scale produces force at a scale we can detect with instruments. Here is what it does not prove. It does not prove that thought creates matter, that intention bends physical outcomes, or that you can manifest a parking spot by vibrating at the right frequency. That claim gets bolted onto quantum physics constantly, by people selling something. The actual science is stranger and more disciplined than that, and, I'd argue, more useful, because it doesn't ask you to believe anything. It only asks you to look, beat. 2-second pause before continuing. There's a second experiment that goes even further into unsettling territory, and it's older than Casimir's by more than a century in its earliest form. The double-slit experiment. Here's the setup stripped down to its bones. You fire particles, electrons or photons, individual units of light, one at a time, at a barrier with two thin parallel slits cut into it. Behind the barrier is a detector screen. If particles behaved like tiny bullets, you'd expect two clean bands on the screen directly behind each slit. That's not what happens. Instead, over time, an interference pattern builds up, alternating bands of high and low probability. The exact pattern you'd get if each particle had traveled through both slits at once like a wave and interfered with itself. One particle, fired alone, behaving on the far side as though it took every possible path simultaneously. Then, and this is the part that made physicists in the early 20th century deeply uncomfortable, researchers added a detector at the slits themselves just to see which slit each particle actually passed through. The moment they measured it, the interference pattern collapsed. The particles stopped behaving like a wave and started behaving like discrete, localized bullets, going through one slit or the other, exactly like classical objects should. The act of observation changed the outcome, not metaphorically. Not perspective shapes your reality in the self-help sense. The physical measurement, the interaction of the detector with the particle, altered which outcome occurred. This is the finding at the center of what became known as the Copenhagen interpretation, developed primarily by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg through the late 1920s. In its core claim, a quantum system exists in a superposition, a genuine mixture of multiple possible states, until a measurement forces it into one definite outcome. Before observation, possibility. After observation, fact. I need to be exact about what this does and doesn't establish, because this is the single most misused finding in all of popular physics. It establishes that measurement is physically entangling. The detector isn't a passive observer, it's a physical system that interacts with the particle, and that interaction is what produces the collapse. It does not establish that human consciousness, specifically, is required to collapse a wave function. That's a much stronger, much more contested claim, and serious physicists still argue about it. What's uncontested is narrower and, honestly, still enormous. Reality at this scale does not hold a single fixed state independent of interaction. It holds possibilities, plural, until something forces a resolution. You have been walking around your entire life assuming that the world is a fixed set of facts, sitting there, waiting to be discovered exactly as it is. The deepest layer of physics we've ever reached says something closer to this. The world is a field of possibilities, and your interaction with it is part of what resolves those possibilities into the single version you experience as real. Not because you're magic, because interaction itself at this scale is not a neutral act. Zoom out for a second. What connects Casimir's plates and the double-slit pattern is the same underlying fact. At the deepest layer, physics can access nothing is active, and something definite is not the default state of the universe. It's the outcome of interaction. Fluctuation first, resolution second, every single time. That validates the paradox from block 1. The ground was never solid, not for the universe, not even at its most fundamental layer. But it opens a harder question, one physics alone can't answer. If reality itself only resolves into something definite through interaction, what does that say about the parts of your life you keep refusing to interact with, hoping they'll resolve on their own? Think about the decision you're avoiding right now. You already have one in mind. I'd bet on it. Maybe it's a relationship you haven't defined, a job you haven't left, a conversation you keep rehearsing but never having. That version of yourself you suspect is true but haven't said out loud, not even to the person closest to you. Right now, that thing exists the way an unmeasured particle exists, in superposition. Multiple versions, all technically possible, none of them collapsed into fact. Part of you finds that comfortable. As long as you don't ask the question directly, as long as you don't force the interaction, every version stays alive. The relationship could still become something. The job could still get better. The conversation could still go well. Nothing has been lost yet, because nothing has been decided yet. That comfort has a cost, and it's the same cost the universe pays for uncertainty. Nothing gets to be real until you make it real. There's a study worth naming here because it maps this almost exactly. In 2011, psychologists Erin Whitchurch, Timothy Wilson, and Daniel Gilbert published research in the journal Psychological Science looking at how uncertainty affects attraction, not romantic fantasy, actual measured emotional response. Their finding, stripped of jargon, people who were told a potential romantic partner's interest in them was uncertain reported thinking about that person more and rating their feelings as more intense than people who were told clearly that the interest was mutual. Not because uncertainty is more romantic, because uncertainty keeps the mind actively engaged, replaying, checking, remeasuring, a kind of psychological equivalent of a particle in superposition, refusing to settle because it hasn't been forced to. What this study proves is specific. Unresolved ambiguity increases cognitive and emotional engagement with a possibility. What it doesn't prove is that ambiguity is good for you. or that you should manufacture it on purpose to keep someone interested. A manipulation more than a few people have tried to extract from this research, wrongly. The finding isn't a strategy, it's a warning. Your mind will keep circling anything left unresolved, spending real energy on it, whether or not that circling serves you. You are doing this right now, in some part of your life. Circling, remeasuring, refusing to collapse the possibility into a fact, because as long as it stays possible, it can still be the good outcome. Here's the binary most people miss. It's not stability versus instability. It's chosen instability versus imposed instability. The version of you avoiding the decision thinks they're protecting themselves from instability. They're not. They're just letting an outside force, time, other people, circumstance, make the collapse for them later on worse terms, usually at the exact moment they're least prepared for it. Not chosen, inflicted. That's the whole difference. Let's go back to the vacuum one more time because there's a detail in it that maps onto this even more precisely than the double slit does. Virtual particles don't stay in superposition forever. They can't. The uncertainty principle allows them to borrow energy and exist unresolved only for an instant, a window so small it makes a blink look geological, and then reality forces the debt to be paid. They either annihilate back into nothing, or under the right conditions near an event horizon or an intense field, they become real, permanent, measurable particles instead of fleeting fluctuations. The universe does not allow infinite superposition. Even at the quantum level, unresolved possibility has a shelf life. You don't get infinite superposition either. The relationship you haven't defined will define itself. Through drift, through someone else's patience running out, through your own body eventually forcing a decision your mind kept deferring. The job you haven't left will resolve, through burnout, through a layoff, through the slow calcification of a self you no longer recognize. Superposition always resolves. The only real choice you have is whether you're the one applying the measurement or whether you're waiting for the universe to apply it for you, on its schedule, not yours. This is where the mechanism gets uncomfortable, because it means the anxiety you feel around big decisions isn't a malfunction. It's accurate. You're not wrong to sense that naming the thing changes it, collapses it, closes off the other versions permanently. That sensation is correct. Measurement really does destroy possibility. That's not a flaw in your nervous system. That's the actual physics of choosing anything. What you get wrong is what that closure means. You've been treating collapse as loss, as though naming the decision kills every version except the smallest, saddest one. But look again at what collapse actually produces at the quantum level. Not less than superposition. Something different than superposition. A real particle. Detectable. Capable of interacting with other real things, building structure, creating consequence, none of which an unmeasured possibility can ever do. Possibility is weightless. It cannot build anything, because it hasn't chosen a shape yet. You are not smaller once you decide. You're just, for the first time, made of something the universe can actually work with. So here's the question underneath the question I asked at the end of the last block. If reality only resolves into something definite through interaction, what if the instability you feel isn't evidence that something's wrong with you? What if it's the exact correct sensation of standing at the edge of a collapse you haven't allowed yet? What if instability isn't the problem? What if it's the mechanism? There's one more layer under all of this, and it's the layer that made me genuinely uneasy the first time I understood it. Not intellectually curious, uneasy, the way you feel when a familiar room turns out to have a door you never noticed. It starts with a thought experiment two physicists ran in 1935, Albert Einstein, working alongside Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, designed not to prove quantum mechanics, but to attack it. They intended it as a takedown. It's known now by their initials, the EPR paradox. Here's the mechanism. Under quantum theory, two particles can become entangled, linked in such a way that measuring a property of one instantaneously determines the corresponding property of the other, no matter how far apart they are. Not correlated like two socks from the same pair, where each sock already had its color before you looked. Actually undetermined for both particles, until the instant one of them is measured, at which point the other's value locks in immediately, even if it's a galaxy away. Einstein hated this. He called it in a letter spooky action at a distance, and he used the EPR paper to argue that quantum mechanics had to be incomplete, that there must be hidden variables, some deeper layer of reality we hadn't found yet, that would restore the sane, local common-sense picture where things have definite properties whether or not anyone looks at them. For almost 30 years, this stayed a philosophical argument, unresolvable because nobody had a way to test it. Then in 1964, physicist John Stuart Bell derived a mathematical inequality, a specific testable boundary that any theory with local hidden variables would have to obey. If Einstein was right, entangled particles could only be correlated up to a certain measurable limit. If quantum mechanics was right, that limit could be broken. Starting in the 1970s and continuing through the 1980s and beyond, physicists including John Clauser, Alain Aspect, and Anton Zeilinger ran the actual experiments. Bell's limit was broken, repeatedly, under increasingly rigorous conditions, closing every loophole skeptics proposed across decades. In 2022, the Nobel Prize in Physics went to Clauser, Aspect, and Zeilinger specifically for this body of work. Entanglement is real, not a mathematical curiosity, an experimentally confirmed feature of reality, verified across half a century, incapable of being explained away by hidden local variables. Two particles once entangled do not have independent pre-existing properties waiting to be discovered. They have a shared undivided state, and measuring one is in some real sense an event that happens to both. Here's what that proves, stated as narrowly as the evidence allows, that quantum systems can be correlated in ways no classical, local, common-sense picture of reality can account for. Here's what it doesn't prove. It doesn't prove faster-than-light communication is possible. No usable information travels between entangled particles, a detail that gets erased almost every time this shows up in a documentary, trying to make it sound more mystical than it already is. It doesn't prove we're all connected in the vague, comforting bumper sticker sense either. What it proves is stranger than either of those claims and harder to package, that separateness at the deepest level physics has measured is not the default condition of reality. Connection is. Isolation has to be a specific, later, secondary state, the exception, not the rule. Now here's the part where physics stops being physics and starts being a description of you. You walk through your life operating on the assumption that you are a discrete, bounded, independent unit, a self, fully formed, fully separate, making decisions from inside a sealed container labeled you. That assumption isn't neutral. It's the exact same assumption Einstein made about particles, the one Bell's inequality and 50 years of experiments went on to break. You are not a sealed container. You never were. Every relationship you've ever had has behaved less like two separate objects occasionally touching, and more like an entangled system, where a shift in one person's state produces an immediate, undeniable shift in the other's, regardless of distance, regardless of whether either of you can explain why. You've felt this. The friend you haven't spoken to in months who calls the exact day you needed to hear from someone. The tension in a room that changes the instant one person's mood changes before a single word gets said. You've been calling this coincidence, or intuition, or just being close. What it actually resembles, structurally, is entanglement, a shared state that doesn't respect the boundary you assumed was there. This is the real terror sitting underneath everything we've covered so far, and it's worth naming precisely. It's not that the universe is unstable. You could live with instability if you still got to be a fixed, separate self watching it from a safe distance. The actual terror is that there is no safe distance. There was never a sealed container. The you doing the observing is itself part of the field being observed, entangled with everyone and everything it has ever meaningfully interacted with, which means the boundary between you and not you was always softer, always more provisional than your nervous system needed it to be in order to feel safe getting out of bed each morning. That's not a spiritual claim dressed up in physics vocabulary. It's what the experiments actually show, at the level of particles. And it's the honest reason this feels less like trivia and more like something rearranging in your chest as you hear it. You wanted a fixed self so you could finally rest. Physics is telling you at its most rigorously tested layer that a fixed self was never on offer. Not for particles, not for you. What's on offer instead is relationship. Entanglement. A state defined not by isolation, but by what you're connected to and how honestly you let that connection register. That's not smaller than the fixed self you wanted. It's the actual shape of what you are. I want to stop explaining for a second and just talk to you. If you've made it this far, some part of you already suspected this before I said it. You felt the entanglement. You felt a decision refuse to collapse for months, sometimes years, hovering in the exact superposition we talked about, costing you energy the entire time it stayed unresolved. You felt connected to someone in a way that made no logical sense given how little contact you'd actually had. You felt the floor tilt on an ordinary Tuesday, for no reason you could point to, and quietly decided that meant something was wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. You've been sensing the actual physics of your own situation more accurately than the story you were telling yourself about it. Here's what I think is actually happening for a lot of you watching this. You've spent years trying to build the sealed container, the fixed, stable, independent self who has it figured out, who doesn't need anyone, who has already resolved every open question so nothing can hurt them by surprise. And it hasn't worked, not because you did it wrong, but because that container was never buildable, not by you, not by anyone. It's not available in this universe at any scale for anything. The exhaustion you feel isn't from being unstable. It's from spending years fighting a fact of physics. I'm not telling you to stop trying to build a life that holds together. I'm telling you the material you've been using is wrong. You don't need a sealed container. You need to get comfortable being an entangled, unresolved, actively fluctuating system that still gets to choose which possibilities it collapses into fact, on purpose, on your own schedule, instead of waiting for the universe to force the measurement at the worst possible moment. That decision you've been avoiding, that relationship you haven't named, that version of yourself you haven't said out loud yet. None of those need you to become someone fixed and finished before you touch them. They need you to interact, to measure, to choose, to collapse the possibility into something real, while still being exactly as fluctuating, as entangled, as uncertain underneath as every particle in your body already is. You were never supposed to arrive at stillness by becoming solid. You were supposed to arrive at it by stopping the fight against the fact that you're not. Go back to the beginning. The floor tilting for no reason. The bad day, the mood, the glitch you couldn't name. You weren't malfunctioning. You were reading your situation correctly, in real time, without the vocabulary yet to explain what you were reading. The tilt wasn't evidence that something was broken in you. It was evidence that you're built the same way the universe is built, unresolved by default, definite only through interaction, connected at a level deeper than the boundary of your own skin. Here's the synthesis in one line. Nothing in this universe holds still until something touches it, and you are not the exception. You're the proof. That's the reframe from the opening. Closed. You called instability a flaw. It's the mechanism. Now here's the layer that wasn't in the plan when you started watching this. The vacuum that terrified physicists for a century, the one that refuses to sit at zero, the one that seethes even in the most empty corner of space anyone has ever measured. That same restlessness is the reason anything exists at all. Virtual particles flickering in that field are the same underlying process that, under the right conditions, produces real, permanent particles. Matter itself, at some point in the deep history of this universe, was born out of exactly the kind of instability that scares you in your own life. The terrifying part and the generative part are not two different things. They're the same field, examined from two different distances. You've been treating your own instability as the thing standing between you and the life you want. What if it's the raw material the life you want gets built out of? The same way every particle in your body was at some point an unresolved fluctuation before it became something real enough to hold a shape. Not a wish, a decision. You don't get to have the fixed self. Nobody does. Not the universe, not the particles inside you, not one person who has ever convinced you they had it all figured out. What you get instead is the choice of which possibilities you collapse into fact. Today, this week, in the conversation you've been avoiding, instead of waiting for circumstance to make that choice for you on worse terms. The field was never empty. Neither are you. If this video did what I think it just did, if something in you just recognized itself in that field, then don't let this be a video you watched and moved past. This channel exists for people who are done pretending they've got it all fixed and solid, and who are ready to build something real out of the fluctuation instead of fighting it. Subscribing isn't a favor to me. It's you telling yourself, on the record, that you're one of those people now.